The Nobel Peace Prize, recognition or politics? This year, a Pakistani teenage education campaigner and an Indian activist have been jointly awarded the prestigious prize. But how does the committee make its decision? And are there political motivations behind its selections? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to Inside Story. I'm Fauzia Ibrahim. This year's Nobel Peace Prize has been jointly awarded to Malala Yousafzai and Kailash Satyarthi.
The Norwegian Nobel Committee has decided that the Nobel Peace Prize for 2014 is to be awarded to Kailash Satyarthi and Malala Yousafzai for their struggle against suppression of young people and children's right to education. Children must go to school, not be financially exploited.
The 17-year-old Pakistani Malala Yousafzai is the youngest recipient of the prize. She was shot in the head by the Taliban for pushing for girls' right to education in Pakistan, and she's been living in the United Kingdom since 2012. An Indian national, Kailash Satyarthi, is a children's rights activist who's been active in the movement against child labour in India. Now, he's been leading mass protests against child abuse in India for several decades now. Well, some say the Nobel Committee has once again made a political decision by awarding the Peace Prize to a Pakistani and an Indian at a time when both countries are engaged in conflict in disputed Kashmir. Well, the Nobel Prize is the most prestigious international award covering many fields. Its committee is based in Sweden and Norway and decides on the very best in a specific area of human knowledge. While the decision to determine the best in quantifiable fields such as physics, chemistry and medicine is based on quantifiable data, the measure of achievement in humanities, however, such as literature and peace, is open to interpretation. And some observers argue that the Peace Prize in particular has taken on a political role and is awarded based on agendas that go beyond the achievement. Well, the Nobel Committee has been accused of making some controversial decisions in the past. Some of those include giving last year's Peace Prize to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons before the agency even began its work in Syria to eliminate chemical weapons. The European Union was awarded the prize in 2012. The committee cited the EU's advancement of peace, reconciliation, democracy and human rights at a time of economic recession. But at the time, some said it should have gone to an individual. And in 2010, the Chinese human rights activist Liu Xiaobo was awarded the prize. But the decision angered Beijing and strained relations between China and Norway. And arguably, the most controversial selection was US President Barack Obama, who received the 2009 Peace Prize after less than a year in office. And let's bring in our guests now for the discussion. Joining us from Oslo is Geir Lundestad. He's the director at the Norwegian Nobel Institute and secretary for the Norwegian Nobel Committee. Fredrik Heffermel is the author of the Nobel Peace Prize, What Nobel Really Wanted. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Mr. Lundestad, if I could start with you. Right, so we have Malala Yousafzai and Kailash Satyarthi who've been awarded this prestigious prize. Were they, in your opinion, the best candidates for this prize?
Yes, obviously, since we have selected them, we think they are the best candidates. We had 278 candidates for the prize this year. It took us a while, but we are very pleased with this decision. And as far as I can see, response from India and Pakistan and from most corners of the world have been very appreciative. So this seems to have been a good year for us.
And Mr. Heffermel, you share the same opinion as well?
Well, I think it's a great day for Asia, for youth and children who are in miserable conditions. And There's a lot of good things to be said about the cause that is being honored this year. But I am very unhappy with the fact that I think Asia and the world would have been much more better served if they had awarded a Nobel Prize. This is the prize of the Norwegian politicians who have taken over the prize and use it for exactly whatever purpose they like. It is not a prize for fine person and making fine persons happy and helping their work. It's a prize for the total disarmament of the world. Nobel thought that as long as you have weapons and warriors around, there will be wars. So what he wanted when he wrote his will was to help the people who were working for that specific way of creating peace. And over the years, this has been completely forgotten. And the prizes in the later years have done their best to confuse and conceal the purpose of Nobel. And it's really a big lie. The whole prize is more and more a big lie if you consider the original purpose and the immense and visionary foresight that Nobel had. He actually wrote his will 50 years before the nuclear bomb, but he was aware that such a weapon could come into being.
Right. There's been a lot of controversial decisions, though, in the past over this particular award. You know, in recent years, U.S. President Barack Obama, whose country is still embroiled in combat, for example, the OPCW, even before they entered Syria to begin their work, they were awarded this prize as well. What do you think, Mr. Lundegaard, was behind the decision to award these people?
Well, let me first of all respond to Mr. Heffermehl. This is nothing new. I mean, we've heard this from Mr. Heffermehl for many, many years, year in and year out. We think that we do this very much based on Alfred Nobel's will, but it seems impossible to please Mr. Heffermehl. I mean, last year we gave a nuclear disarm or a prize for the abolition of chemical weapons. I mean, right at the core of Alfred Nobel's concern. But we did not get much praise for Mr. Heffermehl then. I should also mention that his own organization has come out very strongly in support of this year's laureate. So he's in a very, very small minority. I think your viewers should be aware of this fact. We do not claim a perfect record, I mean, through these 113 years. There have been many controversial prizes, but there isn't necessarily anything wrong in controversy. I mean, we gave the prize to Karl von Ossietzky, the symbol of resistance against Hitler, and Hitler became furious. We gave the prize to Andrei Sakharov and Lech Walesa, and the old men in the Kremlin became very furious. We gave the prize to the Dalai Lama and Liu Xiaobo, and the middle-aged men in Beijing became furious. We are not afraid of controversy. The committee should never be afraid of controversy as long as it feels that it supports basic principles.
Right. I just want to pause the discussion here for a little while, and I want to bring in our Skype guest now, and that's Christian Berg Hapviken. He is the director at the Peace Research Institute of Oslo. Thank you so much for joining us via Skype, Mr. Hapviken. We were just talking about the various controversial nominations for this particular award. Do you think the Nobel Peace Prize is overrated?
Well, I think it's hard to overrate the Nobel Peace Prize. It is by far the world's most prestigious prize, and the interest that we see in the prize this year, as we do every year, is testimony to how prestigious is it. And the very controversies that we just heard about, in fact, also proves how seriously it is taken in various powerful quarters.
Mr. Hapviken, we were also talking about the various controversies. How much do you think the decisions that are made on this particular prize based on Norway's own domestic policies or foreign policies?
Well, in some ways, there is a strong domestic policy dimension in the decision, and that is because the committee simply is composed of Norwegian politicians, a cross-section of Norwegian politics. So the very values that inform Norwegian politics also informs the selection of the candidates. But I do not think that the committee in any way is concerned about the particular interests of Norway as a state actor in the international system. In fact, the prize to Li Xiaobo in 2010 is evidence of that. It's quite clear that if the Norwegian government had its way, that would not have been awarded. The Norwegian government, as well as the Nobel Committee, knew fully well that the reaction from the Chinese would be a strong one, and that this may come at the cost of the improving relationships at the time between China and Norway, and indeed, so it did. But that didn't come as a surprise to the Nobel Committee.
Mr. Heffermel, do you think that some of these controversial awards may actually take away the credibility of this prize?
Getting the world's most disputed prize. The problem is that they had completely forgotten the will of Nobel when I started to study this. I discovered this in 2007, and I made a thorough analysis of what Nobel really intended. But the Norwegian committee and the Norwegian parliament did not want to hear about this. So there is such a massive support for this award in the Norwegian society. Because
are you suggesting, Mr. Heffermel, that this award, are you suggesting that this prize is being used as part of Norway's foreign policy or domestic policy?
Absolutely. I mean, the committee is composed of people who are mainstream Norwegian foreign policy thinkers. They have lived all their lives promoting a strong military and allegiance to the NATO alliance and to the United States. So this is the total, the direct opposite of the peace plan that Nobel had in mind, because he wanted the committee to support, he wanted a committee of peace, friends of peace, who would support the ideas of the peace movement, which was that the weapons should never be used, they should never exist. You have to get rid of the weapons and the warriors, otherwise you will never get rid of war. Right. It's a very fundamental and very visionary idea.
Well, let's take a closer look at this committee. Who actually chooses this committee and the Peace Prize, and who's on it? Well, unlike juries for the other Nobel Prizes, the Peace Committee is based in Norway. Now, the jury is selected by the Norwegian Parliament and has a selection of bureaucrats, politicians and other Norwegian notables. Well, over the past few years, there have been attempts to broaden the mandate and include citizens of other countries. In 2012, Swedish officials investigated the Peace Prize Committee over accusations that it was straying from its mandate of focusing on peacemakers and ending international conflict. Now, Mr. Lundestad, explain to us, what right does this small number of Norwegian veteran politicians from a small European nation, what right do they have to decide who gets this prestigious prize?
Well, it all goes back to Alfred Nobel's will. I mean, he died in 1896, and he wrote in his will that the Norwegian Nobel Committee should award the Nobel Peace Prize, and the committee should have 5 members, and these 5 members should be selected by the Norwegian Parliament. There are hundreds of peace prizes out there in the world, and many of these have international juries. And I've talked with them. I mean, the danger or the complication is that if you want an international jury, during the Cold War, should we have one from the East, one from the West, one neutral? Or should we have some sort of Security Council model, which of course would mean that the prize would represent the lowest common denominator? No, we are very pleased with the record of the Nobel Committee through these years. And we are entirely aware of what Alfred Nobel wrote in his will. So, I mean, Mr. Heffermel, he has his interpretation of this will, but we do not think for a minute that his interpretation is correct. Obviously, he wants the Nobel Peace Prize to be given to his small circle of peace activists. We have to have a much, much broader approach, and we are pleased that the prize has the kind of standing in the world which it has. We don't claim a perfect record, far from it, but we are pleased that the prize seems to be highly respected in virtually all corners of the world.
Mr. Heffermel, I'll give you the chance to reply to that.
Speak? Yeah, there is I'm very much for a very broad approach to peace, and that this should be the concern of every person, and people in all kinds of situations should have that as a main priority. But it's not my interpretation. I will say I have written this book in English, and it's been translated in many languages, and it's been out there. And I have only heard from Mr. Lundestad that I am wrong, but I've never heard anything particular which is wrong in the book. I must assume, since there has never been any relevant or honest argument against my analysis, that I am right. And at one point, in passing me, Lundestad said, I found an error in your book on page 272. And that was the description of one of the winners. And it was he has no argument. He doesn't. The last time there was said an honest word on Nobel and his intention was in 1990, when this Nobel speech was held for the award to Mr. Gorbachev. Then they described the intention of Nobel in an honest way. And it's very interesting that Mr. Lundestad, he started here in 1990, and in his period there hasn't been one honest word about the intention of Nobel. They've done everything they can to confuse and conceal the actual purpose, which is global disarmament, which would serve the world.
You're putting across a very intriguing argument here. But gentlemen, I beg your pardon. Gentlemen, I do need to bring in Mr. Harpviken here. And Mr. Harpviken, you've been advocating that this committee broadens out a little bit more than just this 5 parliamentarians or ex-parliamentarians, and you want this committee to include civil society figures as well, and not just Norwegians as well. How do you think this will change the decision?
Well, first of all, it is the case that Alfred Nobel's will says that the Norwegian Parliament shall appoint a committee of 5 members. I think the way it's currently done, where the seats on the committee is distributed amongst the political parties in Norway on the basis of their relative weight within the parliament, is not the best way of doing that. This is a very honorable task that Alfred Nobel has given to the Norwegian Parliament. I think the Norwegian Parliament should de-link that from Norwegian party politics and appoint a committee in which it thinks comprehensively about how a committee could best be composed that meets the requirements for competence for managing the prize. That committee certainly would include seasoned foreign policy experts from the political domain, but it could also include activists from civil society who have particular competence in this area. It could include foreign policy commentators. It could include foreign policy expert, people with competence and interest in this particular area. And the danger, as we have it today, is firstly that nobody really thinks about what the whole of the committee represents in terms of its competence. And secondly, that there is a tendency also in Norway for seats on the committee to be distributed rather as an appreciation of long and faithful service to the party than on the basis of particular interest and competence.
Mr. Lundegaard, would you like to see this committee being broadened the way Mr. Hapviken has just described?
It's not up to me, because we have to respect Alfred Nobel's will that Parliament should select these 5 members, and Parliament has tried various options. I mean, sometimes they are prominent politicians and sometimes they are not so prominent politicians. But I want to underline that I think the prestige of the Nobel Peace Prize has never been higher than now. So we must be doing something correct. But we are not perfect in any sense. We are not perfect in the selection of our laureates. We are not perfect in selecting even the members of the committee. But many of the basic things have gone right. And one should be very careful in changing things that have gone well.
Now, one of Alfred Nobel's guidelines for the prize stipulates that it shall be awarded to whoever shall have done the most or the best work for fraternity between nations, for the abolition or reduction of standing armies, and for the holding and promotion of peace and congresses. Mr. Hapviken, do you think there is a need to change this guideline given the complex international relations that are currently in place here around the world, given that standing armies are needed and their friends as well as foes?
Well, there is no way in which you can change those guidelines, because this is actually the very will that Alfred Nobel defined for how the fund he set aside was going to be used.
Do you think there is a need to modernize this so that it reflects current global situations?
Absolutely, and I think that is exactly what the Nobel Committee does, and it is what Fredrik Heffermel here is also very skeptical of. I actually think that literal reading of Alfred Nobel's will in the way that it was formulated back in 1895 makes little sense. I think any responsible committee would have to think about what is it that Alfred Nobel's intentions and formulations would represent in the world as we know it of today, and I actually think the committee does a fairly good job, although there have been individual prizes that I would have had problems with. Overall, I think the committee has done a very good job also over the recent few years.
Mr. Heffermel, I guess it all comes down to interpretation of the will.
Yes, it comes to a reading of the will, and what the Lundestad and the committee is absolutely unwilling to is to understand that the question here legally is, what did Nobel want? What was his intention when he wrote those words? And that is very clear, very easy. You can read it in my book. It has never been contested. And the idea, quite different from what Hapviken says, the idea is much more modern, much more visionary. Nobel had a vision of how to make peace. And it is a different world. In this world, you have to have armaments, and you have to have arms races, and you have to kill people all the time. A remilitarization of the international affairs is now happening at a terrible speed. But the idea of Nobel was to start to see that the countries have to cooperate instead of confrontation. They had to find a way of a grand agreement on abolishing all weapons. Of course, this is a very difficult task.
It certainly is, yes.
The approach now that...
Mr. Lundestad, I'm just running out of time, and I need to give you the last word here. In a world where there are so many conflicts, so many wars, does the Nobel Peace Prize really have a place?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, as I've said, its standing has never been higher. But let me respond briefly. I mean, we all know by heart what Alfred Nobel wrote in his will. But we have to make it modern without violating the will. For instance, we have been addressing environmental concerns, and you might say, what does the environment is not mentioned in Alfred Nobel's will. But the first point, fraternity between nations, I mean, what is more important for the fraternity of between nations than saving the planet from global warming.
Right.
I mean, some countries could actually disappear.
Right.
So I think fraternity between nations and the environment, they actually go together.
Right. We're going to have to leave it there, gentlemen. Thank you so very much for this very robust, interesting discussion. Thank you to all our guests, Geir Lundestad, Fredrik Heffermel and Christian Berg-Havviken. And thank you too for watching. Feel free to add your voice to this discussion. You can always leave your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. We're also on Twitter. Look for @AJ Inside Story. I'm Fauzia Ibrahim. From me and the team, thanks for watching.